Meanwhile, here in Ottawa, the federal government has made a big change at the border, and it comes into effect at midnight overnight. At that time, immediate family members will be allowed to cross the border to join their loved ones after a 14-day quarantine period. Marco Mendicino is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. He joins us from the House of Commons foyer. Hi, Minister Mendicino. Good to see you again.
Hi, I wish I could see you in person.
I want to get to the questions on the border announcement that you and your government made today. But first, we're, of course, following major developments on the issue of policing and race. Not too long ago, Mark Saunders, the Toronto police chief, announced that he was resigning at the end of July. In Minneapolis, council there is supporting the movement to defund police. And the Prime Minister, a bit earlier today, said it was time to move forward on body cameras for RCMP officers. Police forces across the country have cited cost in the past for not moving forward with those body cameras. And I just wanted to get your perspective. Is the federal government willing to bankroll this endeavor, and to what extent?
Well, I think that's precisely the types of conversations and the actions that we have to carefully consider. And I want to begin by thanking Chief Saunders for his service. I know the chief and I've worked with him, and certainly as a former prosecutor, care very deeply about public safety, but also care about having to enact some of the justice reforms which are being called for by the public. And let's just take a moment to recognize that we are at a very unique moment. Racism exists in Canada. Anti-Black racism exists. Racism against Indigenous peoples exists, period, full stop. It's overt, it's systemic. And part of the frustration, which I think which I share, and which members of our government share, is about recognizing that we have to condemn it, but words are not enough. We also need to act, and we need to act so that we are reducing barriers, so that we are restoring trust, and we are enacting the kind of meaningful change that is being called for.
And it's exactly, Minister, in that vein that I posed the question to you about what exactly your government is willing to do to back up, for example, the Prime Minister's words today that he is supportive of body cameras on RCMP officers. And I ask about the cost. I know that today you're not going to come out and say, yes, we're going to give this much money to that, but just in that vein of, what is your government willing to do beyond just words? The cost has been, according to police forces in the past, prohibitive for them. Is your government willing to bankroll this? Or is that, are you open to that? Will you commit to that?
Well, you heard the Prime Minister say that he reached out to the Commissioner of the RCMP, Minister Blair, who's got 40 years of policing under his belt, who's worked very closely with members right across our society, understands that we are at a unique moment right now. So the answer to your question is yes, we need to be open to considering meaningful reform, meaningful change to respond to the very serious concerns that have been expressed for far too long. It's been easy to turn away from the injustices that we have seen visited upon racialized people, people of color, Indigenous peoples, and what we're hearing very clearly is enough is enough, we need to act.
Respectfully, on Minister Blair's involvement, you know that there are a number of people in the communities you just listed off who might be, given the minister's previous history as Toronto police chief and his involvement in carding, for example, apprehensive or worried about his involvement, or even concerned that he will not have the level of commitment that you just outlined. What do you say to people like that who have those worries?
I say look at the record that Minister Blair has offered to our community. He's dedicated his entire life to keeping our community safe. He's also dedicated himself to working with communities of every stripe, and that includes racialized communities, it includes people of color, it includes Indigenous peoples and communities. And so we have to continue along with that. And I believe that we will see that leadership there, and that we will enact the kind of meaningful reforms that are being called for.
In the same vein, in the idea that your government's going to do more, according to the Prime Minister, to fight racism, I want to ask you about migrant workers, because that falls under your portfolio as well. The Migrant Workers Alliance for Change spoke to more than 1,000 temporary foreign workers and heard about a lack of access to protective equipment, crowded conditions that don't allow for physical distancing, poor access, for example, to proper food during quarantine. They produced a report that attributes a lot of that to fundamental discrimination in the system. When your government says it's going to do more to fight discrimination, what does that specifically mean, Minister, for migrant workers?
Well, first and foremost, every worker, whether you're Canadian or whether you're a migrant worker, has a right to ply their trade in a health and safety workspace. And certainly, I have just begun to digest the report that has been issued today, which addresses concerns around ensuring that there's adequate distancing, that ensures that there's a wage protection, that ensures that we are providing the kind of inspection powers which are necessary to maintain those high standards. I want to assure you, Vashi, and all of your viewers that we have already taken steps to address each and every one of those concerns. So by providing $1,500 per worker, we want to be sure that there is adequate social distancing and spacing where they work. Number two, we've introduced some wage protections. And finally, we've introduced some flexibility that allows for migrant workers to take on new work if they've lost their current job due to COVID-19. And there's more to do, and I will work very closely with my colleagues in government, Minister Qualtrough, Minister Bibeau, Minister Jordan, as well as our provincial counterparts and farmers and leaders in the industry to make sure that we protect our migrant workers.
You mentioned those inspections to make sure that, for example, the employers are complying with the rules that have been set out. My understanding is that Service Canada conducted 585 inspections between March 1st and May 29th. The penalties for not complying with the new conditions includes fines of up to $1 million or bans, for example, on hiring foreign workers. How many penalties due to those investigations have been levied?
Well, as you say, we've already carried out hundreds of inspections, and my understanding is that each and every one of those inspections has led to a compliant result. So none to my knowledge, but that doesn't mean that we won't issue them where appropriate, and that's the whole point of having a robust compliance and enforcement regime. At the same time, we're going to continue to partner with farmers, we're going to continue to partner with provinces, because we know how important migrant workers are to ensure that Canadians still have access to safe, healthy and affordable food. And that's one of the reasons why we've created this exemption for migrant workers.
So help me, Minister, square the circle. Your investigations or your inspections aren't finding any issues, but what this report shows is that hundreds, more than 1,000 workers are complaining of a number of very serious issues. How do you sort of reconcile the two?
Well, we don't diminish from the findings of the report, and certainly, as I said, having just been released today, we are going to absorb it, and we are aware of the fact that there have been outbreaks. So we understand that this is a real concern, and that's why we have both put into place the financial support that is necessary to support migrant workers, along with an effective compliance regime to maintain that high degree of occupational health and safety. There's clearly some more work that we need to do, and as I've said, we are very committed to working with our provincial partners as well as industry leaders to make sure that we're protecting those workers.
What about a pathway to permanent resident status? Both the NDP and the group that produced this report says that has to happen in order to address some of the systemic issues at play here. What is your response to that?
It's a great idea and one we've already accepted and acted on. In fact, very recently, my department helped launch the agri-food pilot, which is precisely a way in which migrant workers can transition to permanent residence. And that's a recognition of the significant contributions and sacrifices that migrant workers are making. So it's a great idea, and I think that our colleagues in opposition will be very, very happy to see that we've launched an initiative to fulfill that objective.
With respect, that's an initiative, right? That's a pilot program. That's not a full program yet.
Well, we will be taking a look at ways in which we can build on that, but look, that
At what point, though, respectfully? At what point?
Well, we'll take a look over the course of the next 2 to 3 years and examine and measure the results of that. But certainly, it's a significant step in the right direction. It's a way to recognize the contribution and to allow those migrant workers to develop a long-standing connection to Canada, which they build on, and which we want to, as I say, appreciate and recognize through this pathway.
In 3 years, Minister, COVID-19 will be a thing of the past. The report today is presenting a sort of set of facts and experiences based on what is happening with COVID-19 and some of the inherent dangers for migrant workers. A solution that's 3 years off isn't going to address those problems for them now.
Just to be clear, it won't take 3 years. There will be those who enter into the program this year and who will be able to make the transition. And in fact, I would simply point out to your viewers that there already are temporary foreign workers who make that transition. This is just simply yet another initiative to specifically recognize the contribution of migrant workers who work in the agri-food industry. So it's building on the precedent which we already have established, which allows temporary workers to make that transition into a more permanent pathway into becoming a permanent residence in Canada.
I take your point. My point simply is that it's not widespread. It's not everybody. It's not everyone who is detailing these conditions, right? It's a pilot program that will eventually, as you say, in 2 to 3 years, be, all-encompassing. It's not that right now.
What I said was, first and foremost, we already have a precedent that allows for that transition, and now we have a pilot, which, yes, is a first step. It's not comprehensive, but bear in mind, this is all part of a broader plan that we have on immigration, and one that will meet the immediate needs around food security, around ensuring that we're getting the medical supplies, the support to our healthcare system, as well as attracting the best and the brightest and the hardworking, aspiring newcomers who want to add to this country's prosperity and add, honestly, to who we are as Canadians.
Before I let you go, Minister, tonight at midnight, you have announced that some of the restrictions for family members looking to be reunited will be relaxed at the border. When the Prime Minister first floated the idea, sort of signaled that your government was heading in this direction a few weeks ago, he acknowledged that not every Premier was on board. Has that changed?
Well, certainly in the lead up to today's announcement, there has been a dialogue with provinces and territories, and through that consultation, along with the advice given to by our public health care experts, we've introduced a targeted exemption for immediate family members who are related to Canadian citizens and permanent residents. So what we're really talking about predominantly are parents, spouses, dependent children, and this is a way to acknowledge again that it has been difficult for some families. We've had to significantly, all but completely eradicate discretionary travel, focusing on the essential needs of the economy and on the country. But here we have a thoughtful, incremental step in the right direction. We will continue to work with our provincial partners and our agencies at the border to see that this exemption is operationalized as quickly as possible.
Do you have any kind of estimation as to how many people potentially will be able to, I guess, I'm not sure if benefit is the right word, but be sort of covered by this exemption?
Certainly, we've had some of those discussions. I don't have a precise figure for you, but I will tell you that we're confident that we can manage it. And I also just want to underline that everybody that is able to arrive into Canada through this exemption still has to subject to the mandatory 14-day isolation period, and they have to establish that they're going to be in Canada for at least 15 days with the citizen and the permanent resident that they're related to.
Important caveat there on the 14-day quarantine. For sure. We'll make sure to get that through to our viewers. Thank you, Minister. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thanks, Vashi. Take care.
You too. Welcome back to Power in Politics. Cramped living spaces, dangerous working conditions, poor access to proper food. Those are just some of the complaints we're hearing today from the migrant worker community in Canada. They say they're living a crisis within a crisis. Advocates are calling for federal action, especially after the death of 2 migrant workers due to COVID-19 and the infection of more than 1,000 others. We spoke with Minister of Immigration, Marco Mendicino, a bit earlier in the show about this. Have a listen.
It's a great idea and one we've already accepted and acted on. In fact, very recently, my department helped launch the agri-food pilot, which is precisely a way in which migrant workers can transition to permanent residence. And that's a recognition of the significant contributions and sacrifices that migrant workers are making. So it's a great idea, and I think that our colleagues in opposition will be very, very happy to see that we've launched an initiative to fulfill that objective.
With respect, that's an initiative, right? That's a pilot program. That's not a full program yet.
Well, we will be taking a look at ways in which we can build on that, but look, that will...
At what point, though, respectfully? At what point?
Well, we'll take a look over the course of the next 2 to 3 years and examine and measure the results of that. But certainly, it's a significant step in the right direction.
So for some added context, that answer that the minister provided was in response to a question driven by the NDP and other advocates asking for a quicker path, basically, for migrant workers to permanent residencies. So that's the question that the minister was asking. I want to bring in now Syed Hussan. He's in Toronto. He's the executive director of the Migrant Worker Alliance for Change, the group that produced the report that my questions were based on and directed towards the minister. Hi, Mr. Hussan. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell me first a little bit and help our viewers understand exactly what you found out in producing this report? What are migrant workers going through due to COVID-19?
So what we found, we basically looked at our hotline where we've been receiving calls for the last 2 months, and we received a call from 180 workers on behalf of over 1,162 workers, all saying that they are unable to protect themselves, that they see that their living conditions and their housing conditions are making it impossible for them to protect themselves from COVID-19, but they can't speak out because they don't have permanent residency status. And what that means is that if they speak out, they will be fired, they will lose income, they live in employer-provided housing, so they'll become homeless, they'll be deported, and they may not be able to come back in the future because they'll be blacklisted. So what we're seeing is this crisis where migrant workers are unable to keep themselves safe, which has resulted in hundreds of people across the country being sick, migrants in particular, as well as the deaths of Bonifacio Eugenio Romero and Rogelio Munoz Santos. These two men died as a direct result of federal and provincial laws and inaction on repeated warnings about the conditions of migrant farm work in this country.
So let me put a bit of what the federal government has said to you and get your response. Because first of all, the government says they've allotted an extra $50 million to help cover some of the added, I guess, costs associated with new conditions that they've placed on those employers. For example, $1,500, I think it is, for the quarantine period, because they are saying everyone who comes here has to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks. Is that money going to the right place? Is it having an effect based on what you're hearing from workers?
I think the actual number is $900 million. So the federal government has given nearly $1 billion to agri-food in the last 3 months. And all of that money has gone to the richest companies, which make a profit over $500,000. There's this understanding that we're talking about food in this country as, family-owned businesses, but it's largely multinational, multi-million-dollar corporations who are making a profit off of COVID-19. So this money that's going for quarantine, $50 million, which is just a small amount, it's going to employers, but it's not resulting in changes for workers. We found in quarantine that employers are first making it so that workers can't leave the farms, but then they're refusing to give them food. So workers are being provided, a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs to 6 workers for a week to be able to eat. A group of 13 workers just being given a bag of potatoes to eat. And in other cases, because they are not allowed to leave the farm during this quarantine period, employers charging them, $105 for 4 frozen chickens. So there is a huge amount of money that's being sucked out of migrant workers that rich employers, bad employers are doing, in addition to taking nearly $1 billion of taxpayer money, of federal money, which is just going to the pockets of the richest few.
So what you have highlighted, your group has highlighted, and some members of the opposition as well, is to make the path to permanent residency faster. You heard the responses from the minister there on those questions. There is a pilot program. It's not expanded, obviously, to cover everyone. That will take some time. What is your response to that?
So we're not talking about a path to permanent residency. We're saying people need permanent residency right now. All migrant and undocumented people in the country need permanent residency right now because they need that to be able to keep themselves safe. Look, you and I make decisions daily, where we go, where we don't go, when we put on a mask, how do we keep ourselves safe in a public health pandemic. Migrants are not able to do so because they don't have permanent residency status. And as a result, they are dying. We are talking about life and death. Now, this agri-food immigration pilot, I think there's a very simple answer here. Bonifacio and Rogelio could not have applied for it, and they are dead. So no, almost all seasonal workers are excluded. All workers in Quebec are excluded. All fishery workers are excluded. You're supposed to take an English test to apply, but English tests aren't happening during COVID-19. This is, it was so saddening to hear the minister say that as a way to distract from the real problem. He clearly knows this will not stop the deaths, but he's using these speaking points to try and discredit the very real hardship and pain and suffering of migrants in the country, as well as the migrants speaking out bravely and courageously, speaking to us, speaking back to government, speaking in parliament, calling for their rights, insisting that they're ready to fight, and the federal government just needs to ensure that they have permanent residency status so that they can have what they need, which is safety and life.
What about these inspections that the federal government refers to, right? They've increased the number of inspections to make sure that employers are complying, nearly 600. The minister said none of them have been found, have been penalized for not being in compliance. I find that hard to square with the accounts that you're getting, and I asked him to help me reconcile it. How would you?
So the worst part about these inspections is that they're virtual, right? So literally the employers are sending in paperwork over email or having a conversation with someone on camera. Clearly, that's not stopping deaths. I mean, would we do that to the long-term home care crisis? Absolutely not. When we see this, provinces have gone in some cases the army went in. We need firm and swift action to stop death. And again, this is a discredit to the minister and to the department and to workers, where he knows that in these inspections that the federal government is doing can only uphold existing law, but the existing laws are so weak. migrant workers aren't covered under minimum wage, overtime pay, hours of work. Migrant worker housing is not covered under a national housing standard. So what can these inspections really do? And then they're being done over the camera. With the employer. How can workers even speak to the inspector and express their own concerns and share their own realities? I think when two people are dead, one must take this issue far more seriously rather than trying to spin it. I need people to understand, I think everyone needs to understand that if you've eaten a single piece of food in this country in the last 3 months that was grown here, you cannot guarantee that the person who grew it for you isn't dead because of COVID-19, isn't dead because they were forced to come here, because they couldn't get served in their home countries. They were forced to come here, and they potentially died alone without their families, without anyone being able to speak to them in their own language. And at this point, we need comprehensive action. We cannot wait. And that action is permanent resident status for all migrants and undocumented people in this country right now.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Hussan. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Syed Hussan is the Executive Director of the Migrant Worker Alliance for Change. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.